He stood on the porch at exactly 7, hat in hand, not knowing the girl's mother was already watching him through the curtain, deciding in 10 seconds whether he'd ever be allowed back. Nobody wrote these rules into law, but every boy in America knew them by heart. They came from etiquette books like Amy Vanderbilt's, from 17 magazine's dating columns, from mothers who drilled them into their sons before a first date. Break one, and the whole neighborhood would know by Monday. These rules had roots. Just one generation earlier, courtship happened inside the girl's own home, on her mother's terms with a chaperone in the room. By the 1950s, it had moved out into the world, into movie theaters and soda fountains, paid for with a boy's own wages. Every rule you're about to hear grew out of that shift, an attempt to keep order once romance went public. A sociologist named Willard Waller had studied college dating back in the 1930s and found something surprising. It worked like a quiet contest for status, who you were seen with, how often, in which places. By the 1950s, that contest had hardened into a full etiquette, 25 specific expectations a boy carried with him from the moment he picked up the telephone to the moment he said good night at her door. Rule 1. He asked her father first, or at least he was supposed to. Not for permission to marry her, just permission to walk her to the picture show. A boy who skipped this step wasn't rude, he was invisible. Fathers in 1953 remembered courting their own wives under a much stricter system, and this small formality was the last surviving thread of it. That handshake was the father's last checkpoint before his daughter walked out the door into a world he couldn't fully see or control. He couldn't follow them to the drugstore counter or sit behind them at the movie house. So he took the one moment he had, the doorway, and used it to size a boy up completely, in about the time it took to say hello. A curbside honk was such a small violation, one press of a palm, over in a second, and yet it could undo weeks of careful courting. Neighbors on porches up and down the block would hear it too, and by the next afternoon at the beauty parlor or the church social, everyone would know exactly which boy thought a girl wasn't worth the walk to her own front door. A curbside honk was such a small violation, one press of a palm, over in a second, and yet it could undo weeks of careful courting. Neighbors on porches up and down the block would hear it too, and by the next afternoon at the beauty parlor or the church social, everyone would know exactly which boy thought a girl wasn't worth the walk to her own front door. Rule 3. He came to the door and the mother got to look him over. This was the front porch test in full, a quick inspection of his shoes, his haircut, his handshake. It wasn't paranoia, it was the last visible piece of the old chaperone system, disguised as simple good manners so nobody had to admit they were still checking. A boy who watched the clock all evening wasn't being anxious, he was being smart. Word traveled fast between families in a small town, and a father who felt disrespected once rarely gave a second chance. Bringing her home at 9:55 instead of cutting it close at 10 on the nose was its own small proof that he could be trusted with something that mattered. A boy who watched the clock all evening wasn't being anxious, he was being smart. Word traveled fast between families in a small town, and a father who felt disrespected once rarely gave a second chance. Bringing her home at 9:55 instead of cutting it close at 10 on the nose was its own small proof that he could be trusted with something that mattered. Rule 5. He paid for everything, down to the last nickel. The movie ticket, the malt at the drugstore counter, the bus fare home if the car wouldn't start. A movie ran around 50 cents in the early 50s, a shared malt, maybe another dime or two, so a full evening could have managed for well under $1. A boy who let her pay wasn't being modern, he was breaking the deal that gave him the right to choose where they went. That single rule, that the man pays, cut both ways. It handed him the power to decide where they went and how the night unfolded. But it also meant a boy without a job, or without a father who could slip him gas money, simply could not court the girl he wanted. Romance in 1953 was tied directly to a young man's wages, whether he earned 50 cents an hour bagging groceries or nothing at all. It's a detail that reframes the whole picture. We tend to imagine 1950s courtship as effortless because the rules were so clear. But clarity and ease are not the same thing. A boy still had to earn his way into being able to follow the rules at all. One shift, one paper route, one saved nickel at a time. It's a detail that reframes the whole picture. We tend to imagine 1950s courtship as effortless because the rules were so clear. But clarity and ease are not the same thing. A boy still had to earn his way into being able to follow the rules at all. One shift, one paper route, one saved nickel at a time. Rule 6. He called her house, never the other way around. And when he called, he waited his turn. Because in 1953, a whole family often shared one telephone line, sometimes even one party line with the neighbors. If her father answered, he asked politely to speak with her. If a sister picked up first, he was gracious about the wait. The telephone was courtship's lifeline in 1953, but it was a shared, public lifeline. A party line meant a neighbor could be listening on the same wire. So a boy learned to say less than he meant, to save the real conversation for the porch step later, because anything spoken into that receiver might travel further than he intended. Rule 7. He never called 2 nights running, and he never called after 9 at night. Etiquette guides of the era were specific about this. Calling too often made a boy look desperate, and calling late made him look presumptuous. There was a whole silent arithmetic to it. Wait a day or two, let her wonder, then call again. Boys who got this arithmetic wrong found their calls simply stopped being answered, or answered with a cool, clipped voice that told him everything without saying a word. There was no rulebook he could point to if she got upset, only a shared, unspoken sense of pacing that every teenager in town somehow understood at the same time. Rule 8. He never let her call him first. This one fell harder on the girl than on him, but he was expected to notice and quietly discourage it if she tried, for her own sake in the eyes of the neighborhood. A girl who telephoned a boy first risked being called forward, a label that could follow her through an entire school year. It's easy to look at that rule now and see only its unfairness. But it's worth remembering that most of these etiquette guides, Amy Vanderbilt's book among them, were written by women, for young women, as a strategy for protecting themselves inside a system they hadn't built. Knowing the rule meant a girl always had an answer ready if anyone questioned her conduct. Rule 9. He planned the whole evening before he ever picked her up. Where they'd go, what they'd see, how they'd get home, all of it decided in advance. A boy who showed up and asked what should we do looked unprepared, even a little lazy, in a dating culture that treated a well-planned night as proof he took the whole thing, and her, seriously. Rule 10. He walked on the outside of the sidewalk, closest to the street. This came straight out of an older, chivalric idea that a gentleman placed his body between a lady and any splash from a passing carriage, or by 1953, any car running through a puddle. Most boys couldn't have told you why they did it. They just knew a fellow who walked on the wrong side looked like he hadn't been raised right. Rule 11. He opened every door, the car door, the theater door, the diner door, without being asked and without making a show of it. It sounds like a small thing, but etiquette manuals treated it as a measure of a boy's whole character. A girl who had to open her own car door in front of her girlfriends had a story to tell on Monday, and it wasn't a flattering one for him. Rule 12. He walked on the aisle side in a movie theater and let her choose the seats. Small courtesies like this were tested constantly, because a date in 1953 played out entirely in public, under the eyes of classmates, neighbors, and her own friends 2 rows back. Every gesture was a performance of respectability, whether the boy realized it or not. That public quality is easy to forget now. There was no private car ride home from an app, no quiet corner of the internet where only the 2 of them existed. Every single date happened in front of an audience, at the drugstore counter, in the theater lobby, on the sidewalk outside, which is exactly why the rules had to be so consistent and so visible. Rule 13. He never took her somewhere he couldn't afford. A boy stretching beyond his means to impress a girl was seen as foolish, not romantic, because everyone in town would eventually find out what he actually earned. The honest date, a drugstore counter or a Saturday matinee, was respected precisely because it matched what a boy could reasonably provide without pretending. Rule 14. At the drive-in, he kept the interior light on until she said otherwise. By the mid-1950s, there were thousands of drive-in theaters scattered across the country, and they were exactly what they sound like, thrilling because they offered privacy inside a very public arrangement. A boy who assumed too much, too fast, in that dark car earned a reputation that spread faster than any gossip column. The drive-in was one of the few places where the old rules and the new privacy sat right next to each other, uneasily. A boy could keep every single rule, walk her to the door afterward, call the next day, and still have the whole town whisper about what a dark car at the drive-in must have meant. Reputation didn't require proof, only a good story. Rule 15. He never let her walk home alone, not even 4 blocks, not even in a safe neighborhood. He drove her, or if there was no car that night, he walked her the whole way and waited until she was inside with the porch light confirming it. This wasn't treated as optional chivalry, it was the baseline expectation every mother assumed when she handed her daughter over for the evening. Rule 16. He introduced her by her full name to anyone they ran into, never just a nickname, never a vague gesture. "This is my date," Margaret Ellen Carter said something specific, that he respected her enough to name her properly in front of other people. Skipping this, or mumbling through an introduction, suggested he didn't consider the relationship worth announcing. Rule 17. He never criticized her in front of others. Not her dress, not a joke that fell flat, nothing. A public correction was considered one of the cruelest things a boy could do on a date because her standing among her friends mattered as much as her standing with him. The rule protected her dignity in a system that already asked her to be watched and judged constantly. Rule 18. If he wanted to go steady, he had to ask out loud, using those exact words. It wasn't assumed after a few dates the way it might drift today. A boy asked, "Will you go steady with me?" Often nervously, sometimes rehearsed in front of a mirror beforehand, because the answer changed everything about how the whole school would see them both starting Monday morning. Going steady was newer and more debated than most people assume today. By the middle of the decade, it had become the norm among high schoolers, but plenty of parents and school principals worried openly that teenagers were pairing off years before they were ready, skipping the whole point of the teenage years, which was supposed to be meeting lots of different people. Some schools actually tried to legislate against it, banning class rings worn on chains right there in the hallway, hoping a dress code could slow down a cultural shift that was already well underway. It rarely worked. The ring just moved from around her neck to tucked inside a locket, or worn on a finger wrapped in tape, teenagers finding a quiet workaround the same way they always have. Rule 19. Once she said yes, he handed over something visible, his class ring, taped or wrapped with yarn so it would fit her finger, or his Letterman jacket draped over her shoulders. This wasn't sentimental decoration. It was a public contract, worn in hallways and at football games where everyone could see it and know exactly where things stood between them. That ring meant something specific because it cost him something to give it up. Most high schools in 1953 sold one class ring per student, ordered months in advance and paid for out of his own savings. Handing it to her meant walking around without it himself, a visible sacrifice the whole school could read at a glance, which was exactly the point. Rule 20. He never dated anyone else once they were going steady, and neither did she, though the pressure to prove it fell harder on him. Getting caught taking another girl to a dance while she still wore his ring around her neck was a scandal that could travel through an entire school by lunchtime. Exclusivity wasn't assumed, it was policed by everyone watching. Breaking up when it happened had its own quiet ritual too. The ring came back, sometimes handed over silently at a locker, sometimes mailed if things had ended badly. Everyone in the hallway understood what it meant when a girl who'd been wearing a chain around her neck for months suddenly wasn't anymore. No announcement was needed. The absence said it all. In college, the same ritual escalated into pinning, where a fraternity man gave his pin to his girlfriend and his fraternity brothers marched to her sorority house at night to serenade her under the windows. It was one formal rung below engagement, and it happened often enough that most sorority houses had a whole tradition built around how a girl was supposed to react when she heard the singing start outside. Rule 21. He respected the curfew at her dormitory as strictly as the one at her parents' house. Many women's colleges in the 1950s ran under what was called in loco parentis, the school acting as parent, with a house mother enforcing a locked door and a sign-out sheet, often around 10 or 10:30 on weeknights. A boy who kept a girl out past that hour could get her campus privileges suspended, not just her mood ruined. That house mother held real authority, more than most boys realized until they tested it. A girl who came in even 5 minutes late might lose her privileges for a week, unable to leave the dormitory for anything but class. So the ritual of walking her back on time wasn't romantic gesture alone. It was a boy protecting her standing at an institution that was watching just as closely as her parents ever had. Rule 22. He never showed up empty-handed to meet her family for the first time, usually flowers for her mother, or a small box of candy. It cost him little, but it signaled everything, that he understood he was entering someone else's home as a guest under evaluation, not as an entitled visitor. Families remembered which boys brought something and which ones didn't. Rule 23. He wrote to her by hand if he was away, whether at college, in the service, or working a summer job in another town. A telephone call was for logistics, but a letter was for feeling, and a boy who let too many weeks pass without writing risked being quietly replaced by someone closer to home. Wartime courtship in the previous decade had already proven how much a written letter could carry. A girl kept those letters, tied with ribbon in a shoebox or a dresser drawer, sometimes for the rest of her life. They were proof of something a phone call could never leave behind. A record in his own handwriting of exactly what he'd felt on a specific night, in a specific year, that neither of them would otherwise have any way to prove had ever happened at all. Rule 24. He never proposed without first asking her father for permission, a conversation that happened separately, privately, and usually with real nerves involved. It wasn't a formality he could skip, even if her father already adored him. The ring came after that conversation, never before, because the rules still ran through the family, even at the very last step before marriage. Couples in 1953 married young. Most women were around 20 when they married for the first time, some of the youngest average marriage ages in American history. So this final permission often came only a year or two after that first porch handshake. The whole 25-rule courtship compressed into a fast, focused stretch of a young life. Rule 25. However the evening went, he called the next day, not to ask her out again necessarily, but simply to say thank you for the evening. Skipping this final courtesy, even after a date that had clearly gone well, was considered a strange and slightly rude omission. The whole system ran on these small, consistent gestures, none of them legally required, all of them expected without fail. That's 25 rules. But really, it's one continuous idea, repeated in 25 different rooms and doorways, that a young man's character could be read entirely through small, consistent gestures: the handshake, the open door, the timed phone call, the ring given up. Nothing about it required money he didn't have, or words he wasn't sure how to say. It just required consistency. None of it was as tidy as it looked from the outside, though. Ministers and school principals worried publicly that going steady at 14 encouraged too much too soon. The rules were followed with real devotion, but they were argued about constantly, even by the very generation that lived inside them, which is easy to forget when we picture 1953 as one simple, settled decade. And it's worth saying plainly, this version, the malt shop and class ring and the father's handshake, was mostly the world of white, middle-class, suburban and small-town America. Working families, rural communities, and many Black and immigrant communities had their own courtship customs, some overlapping, some entirely their own, that rarely made it into the etiquette books everyone remembers today. By the 1960s, the scaffolding started coming down. The birth control pill arrived in 1960 and slowly changed the calculus of every rule built around risk and reputation. College women began pushing back against locked dormitory doors. The rules that had felt permanent to a boy standing on a porch in 1953 were already starting to loosen for his younger brother a decade later. By the 1970s, most of it was gone. The dormitory curfews lifted. The class ring on a chain faded out of high school hallways. Going steady stopped being announced with a ritual and just became something couples were or weren't without ceremony. What took decades to build disappeared within about one generation. What was lost wasn't the curfews or the door opening, not really. What was lost was the built-in clarity. A boy in 1953 always knew exactly where he stood, dating, going steady, pinned, engaged, each stage marked by a specific object and a specific ritual. Nobody had to guess what a relationship was. The rules were rigid, but they were never vague. You can hear that clarity echoed even now, decades later, in the way people still talk about defining the relationship, or wish for some clearer sign than a text message left unread. The instinct behind the class ring on a chain never really disappeared. It just lost its object, its ritual, its agreed upon, meaning that everyone in the hallway understood at a glance. That's the part I think about most when I read these old etiquette pages. Not the curfews, not who paid for the malt. It's the fact that a scared 17-year-old boy on a porch in 1953 always knew exactly what his next move was supposed to be, because someone had written it all down for him. Generations of mothers and magazine columnists and college house mothers all quietly agreeing on the same 25 rules. If any of these rules brought back a memory of your own, your grandmother's story, a class ring you still have tucked in a drawer, I would love to hear it in the comments. And if you want to keep stepping back into this world with me, the front porches, the malt shops, the letters written by hand, subscribe, because there are so many more forgotten codes of romance still waiting to be told.